I'm Bill Bullard. I represent R-CALF USA, whose members consist of thousands of independent cattle producers located in 43 states. These members comprise the live cattle segment of the multi-segmented beef supply chain. These members strongly support trade between Canada and Mexico in the trade of cattle and beef. This trade, though, must be reciprocal and balanced. It must support our national security interests by optimizing our domestic supply chains. It must be transparent to consumers, and it must include accurate rules of origin. It must also provide protections for perishable and import-sensitive products, and it must promote the highest standards of health and safety possible. NAFTA has failed all of these important principles. It has severely weakened America's largest segment of American agriculture, the U.S. live cattle industry. And very importantly, like the steel industry and the auto industries that are interdependent industries, they are also separate and distinct industries and have very different economic interests. So too does the cattle industry have very different economic interests with respect to NAFTA than do the beef packing sector of the industry. Now, I represent the live cattle segment, which is the agricultural segment of the cattle and beef supply chain, and the meat packers represent the manufacturing segment. This manufacturing segment in our industry is comprised of 4 dominant packers that control 85% of the 25 million head of cattle produced by about 750,000 independent disaggregated producers across the United States. This unprecedented level of concentration gives these dominant packers tremendous buying power, monopoly power in the industry, and they use this monopoly power to extract great benefits from NAFTA, but at the expense of independent cattle producers, the 729,000 independent beef cattle producers we have left. Since NAFTA has been implemented, our industry has shrunk, and it has shrunk alarmingly. We have lost 20% of our producers just in the first 19 years of NAFTA. We can't go beyond 2012. We don't have the census data left. Since the beginnings of NAFTA, we've lost 75% of our independent cattle feeders. Most of those were about 80,000 farmer feeders that have small environmental footprints and have a tremendous benefit to the competitiveness of our industry. Also, we saw our mother cow herd shrink during the pendency of NAFTA. We've lost about 10% of those mother cows. Even though we've begun to rebuild for 3 years, we are still over 3 million head short as compared to where we were before NAFTA. And then the beef production, the output of our industry, has actually trended downward throughout the pendency of NAFTA. And a principal reason for this contraction is because our industry was forced to absorb the persistent and tremendous mounting deficit that we have accrued under the North American Free Trade Agreement. In fact, the 25-year cumulative deficit with the NAFTA countries is nearly $32 billion. And using economic rules of thumb, we can estimate that we have, as a result of this ongoing deficit, about $1.3 billion a year on average. This has cost the U.S. economic output of about $5 billion and cost American jobs to the tune of about 6,000. And now, during each of the past 3 years, we have essentially, the United States has sent Canada and Mexico about $2 billion worth of beef and cattle. And then Canada and Mexico turns around and sends us about $4 billion worth of the same commodities. Clearly, Canada and Mexico will play that game until we decide to quit. So NAFTA imports are direct substitutes to U.S. cattle and beef production. And it allows, they are undifferentiated to consumers, and they are lower cost. These factors allow the monopolistic meat packers to strategically use these NAFTA imports as a substitute for domestic cattle and beef production to lower the prices paid to U.S. cattle farmers. And so when domestic cattle prices go up, the meat packers shift their focus to NAFTA products and thus reduce the demand and the price to U.S. producers. President Trump wants Americans to buy American. They can't do that in the cattle industry because NAFTA doesn't allow consumers to distinguish U.S. beef from imported beef. The single most important thing the USTR can do in modernizing NAFTA is to reinstate country of origin labeling so consumers can distinguish products produced right here in America versus the imported product, as well as to change the rule of origin, because right now the rule of origin allows meat packers to mislabel beef from animals produced exclusively in Canada and Mexico. An animal could live 5 to 10 years in Canada or Mexico, be brought to the United States, slaughtered in U.S. slaughtering plants, and the resulting meat product bear a USA label on it that is deceptive to consumers and harmful to the industry. In addition, we need, my time is up, thank you.
Thank you. We will now turn to Kevin Kester.
Thank you, and good afternoon. My name is Kevin Kester. I'm a rancher from Parkfield, California. I'm here today on behalf of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the oldest and largest national association of cattlemen. I'm honored to provide you with our perspective on the importance of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the risks we face if the U.S. beef industry is saddled with changes to NAFTA that may jeopardize our current access to Canada and Mexico. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. beef industry consists of 913,000 cattle and calf operations, a national herd size of approximately 93 million head of cattle, accounting for roughly $67 billion in annual farm gate receipts. In 2016, we sold over $6.3 billion in beef products around the world, with exports alone accounting for nearly $350 per head for every fed steer and heifer. NCBA strongly supports NAFTA. Because of the terms of NAFTA, Canada and Mexico developed into two very important export markets for U.S. beef. While there may be calls from other segments of agriculture and other industries to update or renegotiate the terms of NAFTA, we strongly encourage you to focus your efforts on those specific areas and leave alone the terms of NAFTA that have greatly benefited the U.S. beef and cattle industry. And quite frankly, it is difficult to improve upon the duty-free, unlimited access to Canada and Mexico. So please, do no harm and do not jeopardize our access. On average, Canada and Mexico have been two of our top 5 export markets, with approximately $1 billion each in annual sales. While Canada has been a high-value market for muscle cuts, Mexico has proven to be an excellent market for cuts like rounds and skirts, tongues, stomachs, and other cuts that Americans find less desirable. Opponents of NAFTA try to paint a very dark picture of disproportionate beef trade, saying NAFTA has been our downfall for over 20 years. Opponents pin all of our problems on NAFTA, but they fail to acknowledge other key factors our industry has faced. For example, the 2003 BSE case that closed many of our export markets for years, the severe droughts that have caused beef and cattle shortages, the strength of the U.S. dollar that puts U.S. exports at a disadvantage, the regulatory onslaught of previous administrations, and the continuation of tax policies that encourage the breakup of multi-generational cattle operations. Simply put, opponents view NAFTA as a zero-sum game and fail to consider important factors such as our incredible growth in global exports and the value that exports bring to all segments of our industry. This short-sighted view is a great disservice to all producers. NCBA strongly opposes any attempt to use NAFTA as a vehicle to resurrect failed policies of the past, such as mandatory country of origin labeling, also known as COOL. Opponents of NAFTA want to use policies like COOL to restrict imports to theoretically drive up cattle prices. This was the goal of COOL, and it failed. COOL did not result in higher values for producers or a safer food supply. Unfortunately, COOL backfired by forcing feed yards and some packing facilities to close down permanently, leading to further consolidation and job loss in the cattle and beef industry. And when yards and plants close, it means there are fewer people competing for our cattle, and consolidation makes it less competitive for the cow-calf and stocker sectors. COOL was U.S. law for over 6 years and failed to deliver on its promises to build consumer confidence and add value for our producers. Instead, COOL resulted in a long battle in the World Trade Organization, with the United States facing the promise of more than $1 billion in retaliatory tariffs from Mexico and Canada unless COOL was repealed. Canada and Mexico still have the authority to retaliate against the United States if COOL is brought back into effect. And rest assured, they will retaliate against us if necessary. We must learn from mistakes of the past and not repeat them. We encourage you to build on the success that the current NAFTA provisions have given U.S. beef producers. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of questions on the country of origin labeling issue. Let me ask Amy Holman to start us off.
Thank you, John. Mr. Kester, could you please share your thoughts on how the exclusion of cool in a modernized NAFTA text would benefit your industry and how it would benefit U.S. trade overall? Thank you.
Sure. Number one, if the government mandated marketing program of country of origin of labeling was reinserted into future NAFTA agreements, Canada and Mexico would go ahead with the retaliatory process, which would cost all industries more than $1 billion a year in tariffs. So that's number one, and including beef and other ag products would be included on those carousels. And so, secondly, there's been absolutely no proof that, and no evidence that cool that was enacted in law for 6 years improved consumer confidence or, more importantly, for our industry, improved prices for producers. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. If consumers were passionate about cool and advocating for it, we would see more labeling programs pop up voluntarily across the country, and it's just not the case. Consumers have a price preference, and they like the products, and so that would be my answer to your question.
Thank you.
And another question, this could be answered by Mr. Bullard or Mr. Grainer or both of you. It's kind of the mirror question to that. You both talked about country of origin labeling in your remarks, and the Congress did pass in the 2015 omnibus budget bill changes to our cool law. So if you could explain a little bit about how you see that being incorporated into a modernized NAFTA. Would this, in your view, require a change in legislation? Mr. Bullard, I know in your remarks you talked about using the J-list approach. If you could describe a little bit how that would be a different option or a complementary option, and Mr. Grainer, your comments on the issue as well.
Certainly. Thank you for the question. Well, first, we don't operate in a vacuum, so we can now look at the WTO criticisms and change the country of origin labeling law to address the concerns that they had raised. Number one of the concerns that they found, or the way they found discrimination, was because while 100% of the livestock had to be tracked according to their origins, less than half of the meat was actually required to be labeled in the marketplace because of the exemptions under the current cool law. So to remedy that, we could, number one, make sure that U.S. producers would not have to pay a dime in order to trace their animals, because we could remove those animals from the J list, which is the list of exemptions under the Tariff Act of 1930 that otherwise requires all imported goods to be permanently and indelibly marked with their country of origin as a condition of entry into the United States. Remove livestock from the J list, then the meat packers can tell at the meat packing gate exactly what animals are domestic because they would bear no import markings. Import markings on cattle would designate those cattle as being born and at least partially raised in another country. So we can overcome the WTO criticisms. That's just one example, one big one. But the other issue is this rule of origin that's very closely related to country of origin labeling. And it's because under the rule of origin, it says that even if a beef product or animal had received minor processing in a U.S. packing plant, then the product can be labeled as a product of the United States of America. This deprives independent cattle producers in the United States the ability to promote and market, their high quality beef product in the U.S. The meat packers' mantra is beef regardless of the origin. In fact, they told our judicial system that beef is beef whether the animals were born in Montana, Manitoba, or Mazatlan. In other words, they benefit greatly from consumers not being able to distinguish the sources of the beef and cattle. And that is a significant detriment to the cattle producers of the United States. So we believe that NAFTA could be renegotiated to include mandatory country of origin labeling, a more comprehensive restrictive country of origin labeling regime than what the WTO criticized, and in the process also changed the rule of order so we have consistency between country of origin labeling and those rules. Those rules should say that the origin is where the animal had been born, raised, and slaughtered, thus giving consumers the choice and allowing competition to work in the marketplace. Thank you.
Grainer, did you want to comment as well?
I think Bill did a very great job at explaining